Okay, let's finish up our discussion on slavery with this last video. Let's talk about how slavery existed in New England and the Middle Colonies. So yes, slavery was not unique to the South. It was very much legal, but not nearly as big in the colonies farther north. Now, in general, slavery in the North was more important in the more agricultural regions. So in urban areas, either indentured servants or increasingly new European immigrants fulfilled many of the laboring jobs there. But nonetheless, there was a considerable slave population that existed in the North. Certain colonies had more slaves than others. The more agricultural colonies, particularly Pennsylvania and New Jersey, tended to have more slaves, and they also had a more immediate connection to the slave trade because they were cities that had large ports, and this ultimately kind of connected them just by sea to the slave trade. Port cities also did have a fairly considerable slave population as well. So New England and the Middle Colonies, slaves either found themselves doing agricultural labor on small farms. Another thing that I should mention here is that it wasn't just the English colonizers that had slaves. Probably the larger slave-owning population in this region would be the Dutch. Okay, the Dutch had actually a longer standing tradition of being involved in the slave trade, and they also had a very mercantile economy. So actually in the Hudson River Valley, you tended to see many, many Dutch plantations or Dutch farms that had a considerable slave population. Sojourner Truth, who we will talk about quite a bit in a future unit, was actually a slave who was, she became a huge anti-Civil War or anti-slavery activist before the Civil War. And she actually was born in New Netherland, and her first language was Dutch. So a lot of times we don't realize that it's not just the Americans, or English rather, that are slaving Africans. So in addition to that, we have a lot of domestic slaves in New England. In fact, that's much more common than to actually have agricultural slaves. And then, of course, you have skilled slaves, artisans, workers, people who actually know how to do a trade. There also was a considerable population of free blacks in the North, actually a much larger population of free blacks than you would see in the South. Again, like slaves, they actually did a lot of the same jobs. They just were not doing them for free, rather, and they weren't bound to a master that the way slaves were. But at the same time, free blacks did not live particularly well. In fact, one could argue that their living conditions were worse than slaves because they were on their own for food, shelter, and any other amenity that they would need to live. So this is very difficult for us to realize, that to be free is not necessarily easier in terms of lifestyle. Free blacks really did not have any rights to speak of. There was no such thing, particularly in the colonial period, for any rights to be actually written down. Certainly slaves were not considered equal to their English counterparts, or their, at the very least, white European counterparts. So any type of local law or protection that a European settler would get, it would not be extended to the slaves. So if, for example, if the place that you lived allowed you to vote if you were male and you owned property and you were above the age of 25, if you met all of those criteria, but you were African and you were free, it didn't matter, you wouldn't be able to vote. Again, free blacks took up a lot of similar jobs to the slaves. So they were also trading people, artisans. They often worked as unskilled laborers as well. But again, the major difference is that they're doing this work for pay and they're on their own economically. So last slide here is talking about some of the ways in which slaves attempted to resist their condition, and I guess the varying levels of success in that resistance. So first off, the idea of being AWOL, or absent without leave, is basically non-existent. So what that would mean so AWOL is a military term, as you probably know, but to be absent without leave, that basically means that you're going somewhere and you're not telling people where you're going, or you're not asking permission to go. You just walk away, right? You just go into town, for example. Now, this is something that is very, very rare, if it certainly, I'm sure, existed in some places. But the idea of actually going somewhere without getting permission is virtually non-existent among the slave community. We also talked previously about the slave codes and laws that existed, doing things like preventing marriage, maybe preventing movement, so you can't go to this part of the city at a certain time, basically like a curfew. Slave codes really varied just in terms of what types of codes they were. So a lot of times they would be unique to the place that you lived in, right? So, you know, if you're in a very rural region, you probably don't have to worry about restricting slaves' movements in cities because you don't have as many. Or if you live in, if there's some kind of interesting feature to your climate that might affect slave movement, all those things. So anyway, slave codes were different depending on where you lived. So there were instances where slaves also would actually take more violent means to try to get out of their situation. So there are several examples of rebellions, either very unsuccessful ones, or not actual rebellions, but plots towards rebellions that actually end up failing. So first, the Stono Rebellion, very, very well-known rebellion in Charleston, South Carolina in 1739. So essentially, this is orchestrated by a group of slaves. They revolt against their masters, and approximately something like 40-something white people end up dead after the rebellion is over. But then just as many blacks end up dying, and then also the conspirators. Most of them are hanged and put on display for all other slaves to see after they are punished for this rebellion. So basically, the Stono Rebellion, even if the slaves it was named after the Stono River Valley in Charleston, just so you know. The people that survived the Stono Rebellion, the slaves that were suspected of actually leading this insurrection, were punished very harshly. And even slaves who were not involved found themselves subject to much harsher slave codes, because basically masters were afraid that rebellions would continue happening if tighter restrictions were not placed on their slaves. Other things, it was not very common for slaves to have access to education or to become literate, but it was even more difficult after the Stono Rebellion for slaves to have access to any kind of education, or also adult slaves could not typically make their own money, so they couldn't have a job where they would get paid, at least not nearly as easily after the Stono Rebellion. You also have two different revolts that happened in New York City, so it gives you a sense of just the fact that slave rebellions were not unique to the South. In urban areas, even in the North, slaves often had very difficult jobs and were subject to difficult living conditions, and they were essentially very much categorized in a subordinate position in society. So the very kind of dense, crowded, stressful living conditions and working conditions in New York were also conducive to revolts. So these New York revolts, especially the one in 1741, also ended in much stricter restrictions against slaves, and just the general sense of fear of white people against slaves. So actually, all these rebellions are going to lead to the greater demand for slaves who were born in the colonies instead of slaves who were coming directly from Africa. The idea to them was that having a native-born slave, as they called it, meant that they would be less likely to revolt. They did not know anything about the culture that they came from, so therefore they would be less likely to compare their current living condition to their old one, and they would be less desirable to actually leave and return home. They had no memory of the place that they came from if they were born. They would have no memory of Africa, of course, if they were born in the Americas. So you get the idea that basically you're going to start to see many more demands for slaves who were actually born in the colonies rather than in Africa. So how do slaves resist their conditions in other ways? Rebellions are very violent, we know, so is there any sort of subtle way that slaves can resist their conditions? And indeed there were, and they were ways in which they could almost outsmart their masters. So for example, they would work much more slowly, right? They would kind of in some ways it was very strategic, right? The idea that you could not work yourself to death or tire yourself out by doing your jobs in a much slower way. Furthermore, if a slave worked incredibly quickly, then they would only be pushed to work that much harder, right? They would show how much they could produce, so therefore their slave master would demand more. So they would slow themselves down so as not to exhaust themselves, but also you could argue that they would slow themselves down to make themselves appear slow, to make themselves appear inferior, to actually make their masters buy into their preconceived notion that slaves were inferior. The masters could basically look at their slaves and say, look how slow he's going. No wonder he's a slave. Again, I'm not subscribing to this idea, but I'm trying to get you to understand that by slowing down one's work, it was actually a way that they could play dumb, and that was a survival strategy. Of course, methods of slave resistance could also be violent, right? One could hurt oneself. It says self-inflicted injury, but I would go farther and say that suicide as well as infanticide happened frequently among slave communities. So that means, yes, in case you were wondering, infanticide does indeed mean to kill one's child. So some slave families actually would rather see their child die than be born into a life of enslavement, right? So I would add suicide to that list. Slaves also could try to run, but of course you can imagine what types of punishments they might face if they were caught. Some slaves, again, another form of suicide, they would starve themselves on purpose. So you could have effectively a form of a hunger strike. And of course you also had subtle methods of communication that could be seen as resistance. So for example, the development of Gullah as a language could be seen as resistance, right? You're speaking in a different language, so your master does not know what you're saying. So you can talk about them in front of them. Furthermore, we could certainly get into a longer discussion about the development of slave culture in the form of religion, music, for example. So even though many slave codes restricted slaves from practicing their religion freely, some slaves would do so in an underground way. Many slaves were converted to Christianity, and with the growing of actually not necessarily the first Great Awakening so much, but the second Great Awakening, which we will talk about soon, Christianity is going to become much more popular among the slave population. So they are going to take a lot of measures to kind of form their own underground churches or just form black churches, right? So that they have a way that they can worship together. And then other than that, I said also music, but that falls into the same category as religion in a lot of ways. It's just yet another way that slaves can develop their own unique identity outside of their masters. So even though this is not resistance per se, I would say it's a form of survival, right? Developing one's own church, developing one's own language, one's own music, one's own food, cuisine, right? These are all ways in which slaves can actually tolerate their otherwise miserable existence. Okay, not to end on a depressing note, but that is hopefully maybe a slightly more realistic take on slavery compared to what you may have learned in previous schools. I'm not trying to take too much of a stance. I apologize if I come across as biased when I discuss this. It's really difficult for me to not take some perspective just because of, I guess, what I did in graduate school, really. But anyway, with that said, I hope that was really helpful for you. And by all means, please feel free to push back if some of the ideas that I just articulated here, if you find them controversial, if you find them not true, then tell me, talk to me in class. I really want to make sure we have an open dialogue. So with that said, I will see you all in class quite soon. And if you're not in my class, feel free to like and subscribe if this helps you study. Thanks.